In the early months of 1944, Japan's skies, once thought impregnable, were slowly becoming a theater of fear. American bombers had begun making daring sorties from distant bases in the Mariana Islands, striking targets that were once considered safe behind layers of anti-aircraft defenses. Factories, shipyards, and military installations, carefully hidden and camouflaged, were no longer beyond reach. Yet even with radar and a dwindling fleet of fighters, the Japanese struggled to contain this growing threat. Then, in late spring, near the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima, a single B-29 Superfortress descended from the clouds, trailing smoke from one of its massive engines. It had been crippled in a long-range raid, unable to maintain altitude with the damaged engine. Yet, remarkably, the plane had not exploded, nor had it been completely destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. It crash-landed in a secluded, overgrown clearing that had been abandoned as a makeshift runway months earlier. News spread quickly. Engineers, intelligence officers, and even a few high-ranking pilots gathered around the enormous aircraft, their expressions a mix of disbelief and curiosity. At first, there was laughter. Its size alone made it seem unwieldy, a lumbering giant of the sky compared to the nimble Mitsubishi G4M or the medium bombers of the Imperial fleet. One officer, trying to ease the tension, joked, "It's just a clumsy American toy. It can't last more than a few flights." But beneath the humor was unease, a growing sense that what lay before them was something far beyond their expectations. The Japanese engineers began their inspection the following morning. The first discovery that stunned them was the engine configuration. 4 massive Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each capable of producing over 2,200 horsepower, were mounted with meticulous precision. Cooling systems, fuel lines, and hydraulics were all integrated seamlessly. Each component fit together perfectly. There were no ad hoc fixes, no improvisation. It was immediately clear. This was not a hurried wartime design, but a machine created for endurance, reliability, and scale. Next, they examined the fuel system. The B-29's internal tanks, combined with auxiliary drop tanks, gave it a staggering range of over 3,500 miles, enough to strike the industrial heart of Tokyo and return to base without refueling. For Japanese designers, whose medium-range bombers were limited to a few hundred miles, this was an eye-opening revelation. It meant that American forces could strike deep into the Japanese mainland, unchallenged by their fighters. No interceptors, no clever tactics could stop this plane without risking catastrophic losses. The pressurization system inside the cabin further shocked the engineers. Unlike most Japanese bombers, which required oxygen masks and restricted high-altitude operations, the B-29 system allowed crews to operate comfortably at 30,000 feet or higher, where most Japanese aircraft could not follow. The fuselage was quiet and surprisingly spacious, with insulated compartments and redundant systems for navigation, communication, and defense. Every inch of the plane had been designed to maximize crew efficiency and survivability. Even the defensive armaments were revolutionary. Remote-controlled turrets equipped with stabilized guns allowed gunners to fire accurately without direct exposure. The overlapping fields of fire created a defensive network that made attacking the bomber nearly impossible. Each turret could cover blind spots left by another, and all were connected to central sighting systems that could track multiple targets simultaneously. It was a level of coordination the Japanese had never seen, and it left engineers and pilots alike in stunned silence. As the hours passed, the initial mockery faded, replaced by growing apprehension. The more they explored the plane, the clearer it became that this was not just a bomber. It was a strategic weapon designed to change the very nature of aerial warfare. One senior officer, scribbling on a map, plotted its potential flight path from the Marianas to Tokyo and back. His hand shook slightly as he realized the implications. Entire cities, thought to be beyond reach, could now be struck with impunity. The captured B-29 also revealed another terrifying truth. American industrial capacity was staggering. Even if Japan managed to shoot down a few bombers, more were always coming. Factories in the United States were producing these aircraft by the dozens every week. The sheer scale of production, combined with the plane's endurance and defensive capabilities, meant that Japan's air defenses could never hope to keep pace. Word of the discovery spread beyond the technical teams to pilots stationed nearby. Experienced fighter pilots, some of whom had once dominated the skies over China and the Philippines, examined the bomber. Their reaction was a mix of admiration and dread. One muttered, "It flies like a dream, even when overloaded. It's almost impossible to bring down once it's airborne." Another whispered, "We never imagined anything like this could exist." The Luftwaffe, often envious of German engineering feats, would have felt a similar awe. But in this case, it was Japan's turn to face a reality that their propaganda could not cover. The B-29 was not just a plane. It was a symbol of American ingenuity, industrial might, and the relentless application of science to warfare. The bomber had been designed not only to survive in hostile airspace, but to operate efficiently and predictably, even under the stress of long-range missions and combat damage. As days turned into weeks, Japanese engineers began dismantling panels, cataloging components, and attempting to understand the production philosophy behind the aircraft. Every discovery was a revelation. Rivets were standardized, wiring neatly routed, and components designed for quick replacement in the field. Unlike Japanese aircraft, which required meticulous craftsmanship and frequent maintenance, the B-29 was almost modular, designed to be repaired and returned to service rapidly. The bomber's endurance also forced Japanese fighter tactics. Interceptors could no longer rely on range or speed alone. The B-29 could outfly, outlast, and outgun them in many scenarios. The realization hit hard. Defending the homeland was no longer just a matter of skill or courage. It had become a question of whether Japan could produce enough aircraft, fuel, and trained pilots to meet the Americans' overwhelming industrial output. Even for the bomber's crew, the plane had been remarkable. Pilots could fly long missions without excessive fatigue, thanks to ergonomic cockpit design and advanced autopilot systems. Gunners could operate from enclosed positions with clear sight lines and effective fire control. Navigators had sophisticated instruments for precision bombing, while engineers could monitor every engine from within the pressurized fuselage. The aircraft combined human comfort, efficiency, and survivability in a way that Japanese designers had never achieved. By the end of the first week, the mood among the Japanese engineers had shifted from curiosity to fear. Senior officers, who had initially laughed at the American lumbering giant, now acknowledged its strategic threat. Maps were redrawn, contingency plans rewritten, and emergency measures discussed. One officer muttered quietly, "If they can build Ds in numbers, we are finished." It was a truth that Japan could not ignore, and it cut deeper than any battle loss. It struck at the heart of national confidence. Even the youngest mechanics understood the gravity of what they had seen. The B-29 was not a temporary threat. It was a demonstration of what a nation capable of combining scientific innovation, industrial organization, and logistical efficiency could achieve. Every bolt, every engine component, every defensive turret told a story of preparation, foresight, and relentless application of knowledge. By the time the plane was carefully disassembled for further study, its presence had already left a permanent mark on those who examined it. Conversations in the officers' quarters turned to whispers about what America could do next. Rumors spread about more aircraft, larger factories, and technologies yet unseen. The bomber had revealed not just a single advantage, but the scale of a war machine Japan could not hope to match. The captured B-29 remained on the island, a silent testament to American industrial supremacy. Even as Allied forces continued their raids, Japanese planners would remember the day they first saw the plane, a moment when laughter turned to disbelief, when pride turned to fear.
and when the sky above Japan no longer seemed theirs. For historians and military analysts decades later, that day became emblematic of a larger truth. Wars are not only won by courage or strategy, but by the ability to produce, innovate, and sustain. The B-29 was not just an aircraft. It was a lesson in industrial power, a warning that no nation could ignore, and a prelude to the inevitable defeat that would follow in the coming months. And somewhere on that small volcanic island, the skeletal remains of the first captured B-29 would forever stand as a reminder that sometimes a single machine could reveal the fate of an empire.
By the summer of 1944, the implications of that captured B-29 had spread quietly among Japan's military leadership. The massive bomber was no longer just a curiosity in a hangar on Iwo Jima. It had become a symbol of an inevitable shift in the balance of air power. Officers and engineers alike understood that what they had once dismissed as a lumbering American plane was, in reality, a technological marvel and a strategic nightmare. Japanese air strategists tried to counter the threat. Squadrons of Mitsubishi fighters scrambled to intercept the increasingly long-range American raids. Anti-aircraft batteries were repositioned and reinforced. But every calculation, every plan, was undermined by the simple fact that the B-29 could fly higher, farther, and faster than anything Japan could field in sufficient numbers. Each sortie of these bombers demonstrated their endurance and reliability, flying over 1,500 miles one way, delivering devastating payloads, and returning safely to base. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. Veterans who had once dominated the skies over the Pacific now found themselves terrified of an enemy they could barely reach. Even when fighters engaged the superfortresses, the combination of pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, and escorting P-51s ensured the Americans had the upper hand. Losses among Japanese pilots mounted not just because of combat skill, but because of the very design and industrial might behind each B-29. Meanwhile, Japanese engineers continued to study the captured aircraft, attempting to understand how such a large plane could remain agile, fast, and reliable under extreme conditions. Every panel removed and every system examined revealed efficiencies and redundancies they had never imagined. It became painfully clear that Japan's own aircraft programs, constrained by resource shortages, fragmented production lines, and a lack of advanced materials, could never match what the Americans were achieving on a massive scale. The captured B-29 also highlighted the broader disparity between the two nations. While Japan factories struggled to maintain production under Allied bombing raids, American plants were turning out dozens of B-29s every week, each one capable of the same long-range, high-altitude missions. The bomber was not a unique marvel. It was a product of an entire industrial system designed for total war. That system, Japan realized, they could not hope to replicate. By late 1944, the reality of the situation could no longer be denied. The American bombing campaigns were devastating cities, crippling supply chains, and destroying the morale of both military and civilians. The psychological effect of seeing silver bombers overhead day after day was overwhelming. Officers who had once dismissed the P-51 escorts or medium bombers now understood that the B-29 had rendered those defenses almost irrelevant. One Luftwaffe-style analogy from a visiting Japanese officer summarized it best. "We are no longer fighting men in the air. We are fighting machines that outlast us, outfly us, and outproduce us." Even Japan's elite pilots began acknowledging the truth. In private conversations, many admitted that nothing in their training or experience had prepared them for a plane that could operate with such precision, power, and endurance. The captured B-29 had shattered illusions and forced a national recognition, Air superiority was no longer achievable with skill or bravery alone. It required the industrial, technological, and logistical capacity that Japan simply did not possess. The final days of the war further illustrated this reality. B-29 raids over Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka left devastation in their wake. The bomber crews operating from bases in the Marianas struck with precision, exploiting the very features the captured aircraft had revealed: high-altitude operation, long-range capability, and robust defensive systems. Japanese air defense was overwhelmed and morale crumbled. The nation's finest pilots faced an enemy that could always return to the sky, always strike again, and always protect its own crews. After the war, when Allied historians and engineers interviewed Japanese veterans, the story of the captured B-29 emerged repeatedly. One engineer recalled the first inspection. "We thought it was a monster, clumsy and fragile, but when we opened it, we understood. It was perfection made simple, a machine built to endure and win." Another pilot admitted, "That day on Iwo Jima changed everything. We realized we were already losing long before the bombs fell on our cities." The B-29's legacy extended beyond the war. Japanese engineers who had studied the plane went on to contribute to post-war aviation and technology programs, carrying lessons in efficiency, modular design, and high-altitude capability. The very bomber that had signaled the sky's conquest had become a teacher, revealing truths that would influence aircraft design for decades. For America, the B-29 was more than just a bomber. It was a symbol of industrial might, ingenuity, and strategic vision. It demonstrated that victory in modern warfare depended as much on production, logistics, and innovation as on courage and skill in battle. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the bombing campaigns, described it as the aircraft that made victory inevitable. And in a sense, that is exactly what it had been. The image of the captured B-29 lying intact in a quiet clearing on Iwo Jima remained etched in the memories of those Japanese engineers and officers. Silent and imposing, it embodied a truth that propaganda could never conceal. The war was already being won in factories, not just in the skies. And so, even as the Allied forces advanced across the Pacific and Japan faced defeat, the story of that single captured bomber endured. A story of revelation, humility, and the staggering power of human ingenuity harnessed on a scale the world had never seen. The sky was no longer Japan's. It belonged to the machines that could fly further, faster, and more relentlessly than any empire could hope to match.